I used to do lots of things.
I used to do things and I'd say things and Jesus, I was evil. Take things and break things and Jesus, I was evil.
All right. Welcome, everyone, to episode 33 of the Reckless Musecast. As you can see, I'm alone today for the first time. Joe is dead. He was celebrating his Mexican heritage with Cinco de Mayo too hard and perished in the festivities, so I am taking over the reins here. Or he's fired, one of those. So I'll be alone today. This will probably be a quicker episode. And we're going to talk about something that's very important to me and to this show, which is truth and free speech and the dissemination of information and who gets to control it. So, as if you pay attention to kind of day-to-day politics, you may have seen a Ministry of Truth in the news a bunch recently. And if your school, whether public or private, was worth its salt, you at least had some exposure to the novel 1984. You either read it or you were given some lessons on it because it's one of those novels that time and again comes up in our present discourse, in the discourse, and sometimes is used incorrectly and sometimes is used very correctly. This is one of the latter times where it is very on point. Sorry, my cat's being annoying. It is very on point and will show that it is one of those kind of evergreen novels and is a reason that art is important and why we made this podcast, because art sometimes in this form, in this time in the form of a novel, really kind of gets to the heart of what the Biden administration has dubbed the Disinformation Governance Board, which many critics, mostly on the right, but some on the left also, have dubbed the Ministry of Truth. Some quick background on what the Ministry of Truth is, and maybe a refresher on 1984 because you haven't read it or watched a YouTube video on it since high school. But when people bring up 1984, usually they are doing so in response to two things. The first is usually omnipresent surveillance. In the novel, there are omnipresent screens all over this dystopian world that takes place. The protagonist lives in what is dubbed Airstrip 1, which is London. But London is no more, it's Airstrip 1. And it is part of Oceania, which is a continent that spans much of modern day, or all of modern day UK, United States, North America, and I can't remember exactly the map, but it's one of the big three power players in this dystopian world that George Orwell created in the late 40s. I forget when the novel was published. I think like 47 or 48. So that's one. So when the UK came out with all the CCTV monitors or cameras, I should say, all over London and I think lots of the UK, or at least the major cities, it made direct and coincidentally, it was the exact city, direct reference to 1984, and throughout time, it comes up time and again. Usually, more often with the second area, which is the manipulation of speech and history to fit a narrative. So changing speech, changing words, whether that's what they call in the novel newspeak or wrong think, thinking the wrong thing, even if that thing was totally appropriate a couple of years ago. So, for example, And if you don't agree, I should say, and we saw a lot of this during the Great Awakening, a time period that Joe and I bring up a lot, which was approximately 2 years ago. It started with the George Floyd murder and all the craziness that ensued after that. But an example in the book would be Oceania has always been at war with Eurasia until in the book, Oceania makes peace with Eurasia, and now they're always at war with East Asia. And it's not enough that, well, an alliance changed. That happens all the time. Armies and countries go to war with each other. Or, that's okay. It's that they have always been at war with East Asia, or they've always been at war with Eurasia. And if you think that Oceania was not always allied with East Asia, then you're committing wrong thing, which is a crime punishable by torture and potentially death in this world. So why they're so well INGSOC, which is this government. It's a portmanteau for English socialism. A lot of portmanteaus in this world. For English socialism, there's really just one governing party. They are the most extreme form of authoritarianism and totalitarianism that you can get, literally controlling your thoughts. So that's good that we don't have that. Instead, we have two ruling parties here, the Democrats and the Republicans, of course. I'm talking about the United States, because that's where I live, and that's where most of the politics that we discuss, that's what concerns me the most. So the problem is that when one party comes into power, and the pendulum is always swinging one way or the other, we have to, you have to understand that the powers that were created under the previously ruling party are now accessible to the new ruling party. And so that brings us to one of my main points here, is that one party usually ends up shooting themselves in the foot, doesn't understand that these powers will be used against them. An example I bring up on the show a lot is the Patriot Act, how that was sold to us by the Republicans, mainly some Democrats. It was sold to us mainly by the Republicans under the guise of, well, if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about. And what's funny is that I've actually heard very liberal, progressive friends and acquaintances literally say this verbatim when I've talked about government surveillance or really big tech surveillance. I'm going to get into what America actually is. It's not all government run, but a lot of these tech companies and media companies hold water for the government. That's always been the case. Now it's become much more for the Democratic Party, but it used to be much more for the Republican Party. It's much more one-sided now. And I've heard them say, because they like Google and they like, well, Twitter until maybe Elon Musk bought it, but these tech companies that are located in mostly extremely progressive, if not mostly liberal, but many extremely progressive cities like Northern California, New York, and some others now, but a lot of them are clustered in these very liberal areas where it's no coincidence that the vast majority of the people working at these companies are going to be of the liberal persuasion and likely voting for Democrats. So they trust them more, people who also vote along those lines. So I've heard them say exactly, if I'm not doing anything wrong, I have nothing to worry about. And it makes me laugh because that's what the Republicans were saying not very long ago, during this century, of course, post 9/11. So how did the Republicans shoot themselves in the foot? Well, the same powers that were used against mainly brown Muslims in other countries have now been turned inward on mainly white conservatives in this country. especially since the term terrorist has been thrown around and has been manipulated to mean basically anyone who doesn't agree with the establishment narrative, which is scary because that could be anyone depending on who's in power. So again, we want to avoid these broad definitions for words like terrorist, insurrectionist, enemy of the state, whatever they are, because then those people can fall under permissible victims to the powers that the government has under things like the Patriot Act. So that was an example of a way that Republicans shot themselves in the foot. So what are the Democrats doing? Well, Democrats, and I want to be clear here, when I say the Democrats, this is out of the executive branch. So this is not like elected officials. Like the Democrats have a supermajority in Congress, which they don't. Let's say they did, and they created this Disinformation Governance Board, and then would be held accountable because, well, there's a midterm coming up, and the voters could hold them accountable because this is, to what I'm seeing, very unpopular, but also kind of flying under the radar because it's, out of the executive branch, it's confusing. People don't really care about this sort of thing. It's turning into a culture war issue, but it's not really a on the nose culture war issue. And a lot of people don't really care about that. If it's not hitting their checkbook or it's not directly affecting their culture war area, like abortion is right now, which is really taking up all of the headspace and the internet space. Stuff like this flies under the radar. Luckily, some people have caught it and it's gotten the attention that it does deserve. So what is it? More or less? Well, what is it is going to be a difficult question itself because it's what is the government saying it is, at least the people involved with it, or what do the opponents of it, who are also in the government, saying it is, which those are the ones mainly on the right who are calling it the Ministry of Truth, which is obviously a derogatory name. So why is it so controversial? Because one, it had a really poorly planned and creepy rollout. The Disinformation Governance Board, that's already a loaded term. What is disinformation? What is misinformation? I don't think they're synonymous. I believe that, and how I'm going to use it, is disinformation. The difference between the two is disinformation includes intent. So it's purposefully spreading or attempting to spread untrue facts and narratives and stories for a certain cause. That cause might just be disrupting an election, right? Or sowing discord would be one. It doesn't even necessarily have to have a side. It could just be pitting two people against each other. Misinformation is just inaccurate. It's just wrong. It's wrong information. It doesn't necessarily have the intent element to it. So what the Disinformation Board is claiming they are going to do, and when I say they, I mean his name is Alejandro Mayorkas. He's the head of the DHS, which is the Department of Homeland Security. What he's saying they're going to do is basically monitor foreign involvement and disinformation that could harm Americans, right? So he alleges that this will not, they will not be spying, they will not be monitoring on Americans. That's comical, one, because of course they're going to say that, and it's like, fool me once, how many times are you going to fool us until we start to get smart? But the other is that there's just some procedural issues with that I can best describe by reading from an expert, from someone else. So first, why? What's the tell here? So this is according to John Schindler. This is in the Washington Examiner. I don't know exactly who he is, but I read something else that says he's not, necessarily a partisan person. I don't think I don't even think he's a Republican. I think he might even be a Democrat. I'm not positive on that, so don't quote me. But basically, one, he states that we already have this in the, it's called the GEC, and this already monitored the Global Engagement Center, which its stated mission is to recognize, understand, expose, and counter foreign state and non-state propaganda and disinformation efforts aimed at undermining or influencing the policy, security, or stability of the United States, its allies, and its partner nations. That's exactly what the alleged Disinformation Governance Board, which I'm going to call the DGB from now on, is stating their goal is. So why do we need two of the same thing? Well, the government always gets bigger. We know that. Why not have more bureaucrats? So that could be a reason, right? Well, why not? That one, it might make Biden. It might be a political move. I think it's going to backfire, but it might be a political move. Say, I'm doing something. Biden's approval ratings are in the tank. The country is hurting with inflation. There's probably going to be a recession coming very soon as interest rates increase. So this might just be a signal that, hey, we're trying to do something to, and that something would be a signal to our base, which is not very animated right now, which is never a good sign for the midterms. That being said, the abortion, which I'm not going to get into, the Roe versus Wade, which is likely going to be turned over, or I should say overturned, will animate that base potentially and could mess things up for the Republicans. So the Republicans are the dog that caught the car and now don't know what to do. So that could be part of it, right? But what Schindler says here, sorry, is that his name? Yeah, what Schindler says here also is that the tell is that this is within the DHS, which has a clearly stated domestic mission, since the GEC is already handling foreign disinformation, while Homeland, right in the middle of the DHS title, rather gives the game away. This is what Schindler says. This is a huge issue that George Bush created. He created the DHS in the wake of 9/11, and created to have a strong policing arm. So I shouldn't have said that these are just bureaucrats. They have policing powers. They have weapons. They're the government. So not just the government, they are a policing arm of the government, which is, this is where the alarm bell should start to ring. This has nothing to do with Russia, and I'm going to get into that. I don't know enough about the border issue. He says some things about the cartels. I don't really understand how, even if the cartels are spreading disinformation about Biden being so open to the border, or open to those coming to the border, those are people who are outside of our country. So I don't really follow the logic there. That would be spreading disinformation within Mexico or Honduras or Nicaragua or one of those countries. Also, what Mayorkas says is that Jankowicz, so I should back up and say the czar, the head of this, her name is, excuse me, oh, I forget her first name. It's something Jankowicz, and she is a character, Nina Jankowicz. She, I'm cursing her right now, not for becoming a bureaucratic lizard, but for getting the Mary Poppins song stuck in my head, because you've probably seen her video, which she does a supercalifragilisticexpialidocious song to a bunch of political usual cringe bullshit. So don't watch it if you haven't yet, because it will get stuck in your head. It's very frustrating. She said things like, all Republicans, not all, but Republicans spread disinformation, right? Which is a fine statement to make. Anyone can say that, but not if you're going to be the head of the Disinformation Governance Board. And then when Mayorkas is asked, is this person neutral? Because they have said this is going to be nonpartisan, which nothing is nonpartisan anymore. That is part of the government. Mayorkas responds, absolutely so. Absolutely so, that she's going to be neutral. When he asked, the interviewer's name is Bash, asks, would you be okay if Donald Trump were president? If he created the DGB, or if in his place he was in 2024, that he's in charge of such a thing? Mayorkas evades the question. I believe that this working group that gathers for best practices, yada, yada. He does not answer the question because people like him cannot even fathom that Trump might be president again. It's their worst fear. So I hope that explains what it is. It's still pretty vague, which has harmed its rollout. It doesn't make a lot of sense procedurally. And it is, it's to me a very blatant maneuver to monitor us further, because the government doesn't like when we think for ourselves, right? They want to control every aspect of your life, because why not? Why wouldn't they, right? What their incentives are to know what we're doing and what we're thinking and how to tax it, basically. They don't like it because the mainstream media, corporate media, the cathedral media, whatever you want to call it, I kind of waver between these terms. I try and be consistent. I don't like to necessarily say mainstream all the time, because a lot of them aren't mainstream popular in terms of numbers. They're mainstream because that's what's on the cable package. That's what's playing in the airport. That's what's on. Well, that's really it, because most places don't even play this stuff anymore. But they also get preference on sites like Google and Twitter, and hopefully that changes, and Facebook and YouTube. They get the CNN gets preference. I don't know if people know that, but they get preference on splash screens, on banners, because they have the capital to do so. They pay for that. Where alternative media gets buried a lot of times. So, okay. So that explains, I hope, what they're going to do, which I can update as time goes on. I'm concerned about this because, I should also note that this happened, I think 2-3 days after Elon Musk bought Twitter, which, although Elon Musk only a few years ago was considered a darling of the left, understandably, he wanted to create carbon neutral technology, solar panels. He helped proliferate solar panels, create more green transportation and infrastructure. He likes free speech, so now he's the enemy of the Democrats, which should be a tell right there. And they don't like when people, do some research or seek their media from other people who also are sometimes wrong. It's not like any one person out there, whether it's Joe Rogan or Brian Stelter or Jimmy Dore, whoever it is, they're not always right about everything. The problem is that when an alternative media personality, I don't even like that term, an alternative media person does get something wrong, they get raked through the coals, they get called a conspiracy theorist or spreading misinformation at best, disinformation at worst. But when the corporate media does it, and they do it all the time, they don't even address it. They don't own up to it, or if they do, it's a blip, it's a footnote, if it's in writing. And that's what I want to get into now. I want to get into all of the ways that, not all of the ways, because that would probably last until I died if I did that even nonstop. But I want to get into many different ways how both the government and the media have lied to us. Uh, at best, or at worst, lied, disinformation, or have just been factually inaccurate, misinformation, which sometimes will happen. But again, they're allowed to get away with it. That's the whole problem with this. It's that people like Nina Jankowicz are biased. They want to decide what is right and what's wrong. Does that necessarily mean that anything that doesn't comply with their establishment narrative will get removed? I sure as hell hope not. But to me, it sounds like they want to put kind of the stamp of the DGB approval on whatever it is, just like the CDC, just like the WHO. It's like you get that little banner, you get that stamp, which sometimes is wrong. I'll go into that too. But that's what they want to control. If they just start taking things down, removing topics, removing people, I don't think that would fly. But I do think that they want to have that official narrative. Like, this is the right thing. It doesn't mean, Americans, you can't go hear the wrong thing. You can't hear anything else. But if it's not conforming with this, then it is wrong. That's where I think they're going. So let's do some history. So I have some notes here, and these are just the presidents. So I'm going to be very clear. These are the presidents of the United States who, if anyone, should not, in my opinion, should not lie to you or, or should do a better job with accuracy, right? Some misinformation. It should be the president, right? So I have a bunch of different examples here from different presidents. Some I've given more detail on, others I have not. So starting with, let's say, Lyndon B. Johnson lying about the Gulf of Tonkin, where even in 1964, when these attacks happened, the first was an attack. It sounded like a miscommunication, and people were harmed on both sides, I believe, North Vietnamese and American. But it's really the second alleged attack, that was the pretext for Johnson sending, basically creating the draft and sending thousands, hundreds of thousands of American young men, some teenagers, to die in a stupid fucking war. And I'm not going to include on here. I had some instances that were more promises that weren't kept. I think that's tough, because whether they knew they weren't going to keep those promises at the time, I mean, that's just fucking politics. And things do, and every single politician I could list would have campaign promises not kept, and sometimes it's not their fault, or whatever. So I did have Johnson saying no American boys are going to die in a war that Vietnamese boys should be fighting, something along those lines. I took that out. But this, where even in 1964, it was dubious at best that the second attack happened. But Johnson, if you saw the LBJ movie with Bryan Cranston, again, I don't know if it was all factually accurate, but he says, he wanted to attack the right from the right on this term because he didn't want to be looked at as weak. So he used this as pretext to send hundreds of thousands of American boys and young men to die in the jungle. The next would be Nixon, Watergate. I'm not going to go into more detail about that. He was literally impeached for it. Reagan lied about Iran-Contra. Again, I don't need to go into that much either, but here you have basically a president who is supposed to be hard on one of our enemies, actually working with one of our enemies. And you can dig into that if you'd like. Clinton, Monica Lewinsky, that's all I have to say. I did not have sex with that woman. Bush, WMDs in Iraq. I don't need, that's probably the most egregious one on here. All of these presidents are probably war criminals. I think you can make the argument for almost all of them, but Bush absolutely should be in prison. Obama, I have a couple here. So this one is a little lighter, but he's brought up the gender pay gap, and he had some initiative about closing the gender pay gap, which time and again has been debunked. The gender pay gap does not exist in the way that it's usually portrayed. I used to think that if a man and a woman had the same job, let's say they worked at Corporation X, they were both middle management at Corporation X, that the man made $100,000 and the woman made $77,000. I think they usually say 77 cents on the dollar, right? That's just not true. Doesn't mean sometimes that won't happen. Sometimes it might be the opposite. But the fact that the statistic that gets thrown around that women make, I think it was 77 cents on the dollar. I don't know if they're still saying that. Is just simply not true. What is true is when you combine all of men's income and women's income based on the jobs that they take, the fields they go into, that's why men make more money. The top 10 most common jobs for men that are overwhelmingly male are things like different sorts of engineering, different sorts of computer science, to be a broad term, to use a broad term, and more basically lucrative jobs where more women go into social work, pre-K, different types of therapies. I think this is changing, especially in business, law, medical school. I think even most law schools now are majority women. I think mine was when I was there. Some of these areas are changing, but that's basic. That's why. It's because men go into more lucrative career, like have more lucrative career paths. But I do believe that's changing. But even the Washington Post, the very Democratic friendly Washington Post, gave this two Pinocchios, quote unquote, two Pinocchios. Another one would be when Obama said to Bill O'Reilly during an interview on Super Bowl Sunday in 2011, I didn't raise taxes once. PolitiFact labeled this as patently untrue and gave several examples of taxes both on the wealthy and sin taxes on cigarettes and suntanning and other different things that are sin taxes, and taxes on people making a good amount of money, but he was saying in the context that he never raised taxes on anyone, which again is just untrue. So would Obama get flagged for spreading misinformation at best? Well, under the DGB, he would, and that's our president. Trump lied all the time, but one I have here is that that the murder rate was the highest in 45 years at the time, and at the time this was completely untrue. The murder rate now the past couple of years might be the highest it's been in 45 years. But when Trump said this, which I believe was before he was president, I'd have to check on that. He was obviously saying it in a way, because if he was president, he would say the murder rate was low, which it was. Murder rate had been declining since the 90s, and almost everywhere. When you had heights of the murder rates in places like New York and LA, in New York in 70s and 80s, LA in the 90s, New Orleans, I know, was murder capital in 94, Detroit. These places had all been decreasing their murder rate for decades, for at least a couple decades, until the past couple of years. And then Biden, and I think this will, well, it won't, because I want to continue a little more with some, I want to continue a little more with some issues in the past before going on to the more present. Biden stated the vaccinated cannot spread COVID. He said this months after a study showed that the vaccine does not stop the spread. People, I still think, believe that the vaccine does stop the spread, which it doesn't. I'm going to get into that. And Biden, of all people, should know this. COVID, for a while, was his best area. He had good approval ratings in this area. maybe because he was lying to people. But that's unacceptable. So with Biden now, if a right-wing civilian or right-wing podcast host or something was saying that the vaccinated can still spread COVID, which is scientifically accurate. If you were saying that when the vaccine first rolled out, when this idea that the vaccine does stop the spread, even though it was wrong at the time, does stop the spread. If you were saying that it does not, you would at best be given a label saying, if you want the real, information on COVID, click here, right? That's kind of what you see now, which links you to the CDC. At worst, you would be banned, which could be your livelihood if you're on YouTube or Twitter or whatever it is. That's how a lot of people make their money, by monetizing their videos, and they have subscribers or advertisers, or just make money off of clicks. So, and watch time. So they were literally taking people's livelihoods away, even though they were saying factually accurate statements, because it didn't fit the narrative, right? It didn't fit the establishment narrative. A few more. Some of these are kind of funny, and then I'll get into the more present day. And then we're going to tie this into, art and why, it is so important to embrace art and to use it for these contemporary issues. So, cigarettes during World War II, there's already a movement against cigarettes. It's not, I think people believe they show that advertisement of, 2 out of 3 doctors recommend Marlboro Reds or something like that. And people think like, oh, everyone in the 50s and early 60s knew that cigarettes, or didn't know the cigarettes were bad for you. Everyone was ignorant. It's like, that's not true. People believed, it might have been minority, but people did believe that cigarettes were bad for you as early as World War I. There were temperance movements against it for its health, not just for a vice, but for its health consequences. And the government, one, to boost morale of American soldiers, the government ramped up cigarette production to send to GIs overseas, and that not only increased, obviously, the soldiers' addictions, but it increased just the average American's addiction. I don't have the exact number, but there was a huge, let me see here, give me a sec. American soldiers, so a way to show you're patriotic, and because it looked cool, people at home, not soldiers, people at home would start smoking much more than they had before. Cigarette production tripled during the war years. And by capitalizing on patriotic support from American soldiers in their advertisements and public messaging, cigarette companies were able to overcome the earlier wave of anti-cigarette sentiment in the country. And the per capita cigarette consumption jumped from 134 per year to 310, and it would not be until decades later that the mass spread of nicotine addiction that the government would embrace tobacco regulation. But by that time, Americans had long forgotten that the government had once been one of the drug's biggest promoters. So, there you have it again. You have the government working in tandem with media, or advertising in the sense, to get millions of people hooked on cancer sticks. Another example would be Walter Duranty. I don't know if I'm saying that name right. A reporter for the New York Times, which is, for some reason, to many still considered one of the bastions of trustworthy media. It's not. I tell you that. A lot of people believe it to be, a very reputable source. And this goes all the way back to the 1930s when he reported that there's no famine going on in the USSR, that he wasn't the only reporter who parroted the Soviets' line. He was at a prestigious paper, actually won a Pulitzer Prize for his his coverage of Stalinist Russia. He also justified the brutality of Stalin's Gulag system as a necessary measure that would ultimately benefit the Russian people. So here you have a reporter from the New York Times telling you that spreading disinformation, that there's no famine going on, which could not be a mistake. It could not be misinformation. So it has to be disinformation. It's intentional for him to say that there was no famine going on, and that the suffering of these everyday Soviets would eventually benefit those same people in the end. Another example, this would be the Tuskegee study on black men in the 1930s. Here we have a more direct government spreading not only, it's pure evil. The U.S. Health Service funded the study that allowed civilians. These were, I have black, I think it was black women too, or women were kind of collateral because they would, sleep with the black men, their husbands, boyfriends, whatever it is. And these people would suffer and die from syphilis. The treatments were available. The U.S. Health Service, these doctors knew that treatments were available, and they withheld them to conduct experiments that were not known to those involved. And what more do you need to hear? Well, I have a couple more examples. And by the way, this was the incident that Biden confused recently with the Tuskegee Airmen, who were black pilots during World War II, and Biden confused those two things. And he's the president of the United States. I can't get into this too much because it would be a series of several multi-hour episodes. But MK Ultra, which was the CIA, and again, this has been released. These aren't conspiracy theories. This is not common knowledge, but accessible knowledge, that CIA, which, bringing it back to the DGB, saying we won't spy on Americans, we won't monitor, that's my word, we won't monitor Americans. Well, the CIA was never supposed to operate within the United States. They're strictly supposed to be foreign. So when I say, where have we heard that one before? Well, this is a perfect example. So MK Ultra, when CIA conducted experiments on unwitting patients, which included, but were not limited to, prisoners, mental patients, prostitutes and their johns, drug addicts, and others who were basically seen as disposable, people who were part of the counterculture. This was really, I believe this was in the 50s and 60s. It was a really big part of the 60s. And the pretext for this was, we're fighting the Soviets, right? They're doing this shit. They're working on mind control. We need to do the same. And to do so, we need to conduct experiments that killed people and ruined people's lives, for the greater good. Of course, this was all pseudoscience. And the purpose was for them to literally control our minds. They literally want to control your minds to see if they could kind of initiate or ignite some sort of superhuman or assassin or something along those lines. It's a really interesting topic. When the CIA came out with their DEI or DIE, as I call it, led commercials. This is when I was calling them BLMK Ultra. It's pure evil, and these are the people who are then saying, well, we need more Latinx, indigenous, trans officers or agents to destroy Guatemalan, Nicaraguan governments, right? That's so as long as you have you render a different gradient, you're fit for the job to go destroy other people's lives. Operation Chaos. This will be the last one from the past. These specifically targeted counterculture and anti-war figures. Examples of these were Students for Democratic Society, feminists, Black Panthers, among others. This was not uncovered until the early 70s and the Watergate scandal. So, again, this is the government just finding any dissidents, and this is a good one to end on here for the past history, because then it was a very conservative government. Even the Democrats then were, by today's standards, considered conservatives, where the kind of new left, this is where, and the Democratic Society, Students for Democratic Society, this is where kind of which were then a lot of people called themselves communists. This is where the more left wing comes from now. But back then, even the Democrats were fairly conservative. I don't know if you remember, there was the big protest in 1968 in Chicago. That was not a protest at any Republican event. It was the Democratic National Convention that they were protesting for the Democratic Party. So back then, they saw Students for Democratic Society, the basically been called the socialists, maybe communists, feminists, Black Panthers. Those were the targets, right? Well, now the target is usually the uneducated white male. It doesn't always have to be. That's because the Democrats are in power. Everything I'm saying could be changed to these targets again if the Republicans get power, right? Once you create the power to monitor, to surveil, to arrest, to raid, whatever it is, well, then when the other team gets in power, they're going to use those powers. They rarely will get rid of the power that they're afforded. So then it was the Black Panthers. Now it's going to be, whatever group the Democrats consider to be terrorists. And that term, I don't use that term lightly. I use that term because that's the term that they're using. Everyone now is a white supremacist or a terrorist or an extremist, any one of those labels, and so that's who they're going after, right? And this is the same concept. Some more recent examples. Let's see, and now, so basically all of that, and that maybe that felt a little off topic. That was because these are the people who want to tell you what's true, right? They've lied about wars. They've lied about scandals. They've lied about statistics, which should be fairly easy. They've lied about literally everything because their whole job is to stay in power, say or present things that are enough to get them 51% of the vote, to get them on the good side of lobbyists. And that's another thing I wanted to discuss. So another issue is we have this revolving door of Congress into lobbyists for corporations, and that's why it's hard to say, well, if the government is not, if they're their own separate thing always, well, then maybe they can be more neutral, right? They're civil servants, as they say, and why is it so hard for them to be neutral? Well, this is why. Is because even though to many of us they make a decent salary, I think Congress now makes a House member makes $177,000 a year, something like that. Obviously, everyone wants more, and they want to leverage their power to get onto a board somewhere, right? I don't know why I couldn't find data that was more recent. So a lot of these people, I won't list them all. I don't really need to list any, but so I've info from 2015, right? I would have loved to find anything more more recent, but basically out of the top 25 members of Congress who then went on to boards, um, it was pretty evenly split. It was 13 Republicans, 12 Democrats. Eric Cantor, it's funny to hear that name again. I hadn't heard the name in a while, being the biggest. So people will say, well, why isn't Kristen Sinema upholding the values that she ran on, that she said she was going to do? Well, bet your ass that Kristen Sinema wanted to get into Congress. She probably doesn't really give a shit if she's going to win her next election. If she's going to get on board at some medical company, right? Some pharmaceutical company, probably. Because she didn't run on these things, and someone got in her ear, hey, you have this fat bag waiting for you when you get out if you don't vote on this, this, or this. So we'll see if that plays out. But basically, as long as members of Congress are permitted to go onto boards for corporations that then they can buy stocks for, which is a whole nother issue I won't get into. There is no like they're all going to be partisan, and they're going to lean into special interests because that's who's going to be the moneymaker when they decide they're finished in Congress. Or if they want to stay in Congress, because there are a lot of dinosaurs who have remained in Congress, that's who's going to donate to their campaigns, right? So it could be a salary or it could be campaign donations, but it's going to be one or the other. That's why people get so upset. Well, why aren't they voting for this? Well, I'll benefit from this, or many of us will. It's very popular. Well, this is why. Okay, so this will probably get us in trouble, but it doesn't matter. We're going to talk about a few instances of misinformation and disinformation during COVID, and why is it important now? It's not just a rant for me about Dr. Fauci or COVID, but it's because the person who's going to be heading this, honestly, it feels like a fucking show. It feels like a skit. But the person who's going to be heading the DGB spread this disinformation and misinformation. First, a lot of people bring up was Dr. Fauci's noble lie of telling Americans not to wear masks during the early stages of the pandemic. Then he said to wear masks all the time. Then it's not necessary outside, but to double mask inside. Then to continue wearing masks after being vaccinated, even though there's misinformation spread saying that getting vaccinated will stop the spread. Rachel Maddow, of course, spread this. I'll give her credit and say misinformation, but Rachel Maddow didn't have any consequences for that. She's beloved by the left. She's the only person who really who has any following over at MSNBC, even though she spread misinformation. Do you think that Nina Jankowicz would label her a misinformation spreader? No, absolutely not, because Nina Jankowicz spread this misinformation concerning the masks. There's a tweet from her that she says she's responding. And I know people like Twitter is important. It is where people make their statements. This is speech, so you can, and there's a record of it. Surprisingly, she hasn't deleted any of this yet. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's all been screenshotted. But back on, I believe, March 4th of 2020, she says that Facebook should stop permitting ads. I'm paraphrasing here, but this is the substance of what she said is it needs to stop spreading disinformation in the forms of ads for masks. Because Dr. Fauci said that masks don't help. Now, his noble lie was, well, we rely on PPE. PPE. And the need to go to nurses, and that's whether that's okay or not. That's a separate conversation, but it is disinformation. It's a lie. He knows that that's not true. And if you lost a loved one in the early stages of COVID, that you would never know, but could have been prevented by you or your family or them wearing a mask. Well, I don't know how you would take that noble lie. But she spread this, the head of the DGB right now. So that's one example. That was her first. And I want to be clear to kind of cover myself right now, because although I thought it was common knowledge that vaccines don't stop the spread, and for the record, I am vaccinated. I was vaccinated fairly early on my own. I wanted to get vaccinated. I weighed the costs and benefits. I thought it was the right thing to do. I thought that, and I still believe any mandates, any mandates are horrific. And I think the boosters are. I've been boosted twice, and I don't know if I would have gotten my second one if my job didn't make me. I think it's bullshit, but I did, and I don't understand why. I don't understand why I have to or why I had to. That being said, I want to cite the CDC. So this is from the CDC website, and this was from last week. And nowhere does it mention where we have why you should get vaccinated. Nowhere does it mention on the CDC website that it stops the spread or that it stops vaccinated people from getting COVID. What the vaccines do is they protect those who get the vaccine from serious illness and death. It's supposed to help for that. I believe it does. And that is probably enough for many people. If there's this very contagious disease, very contagious virus, I can get this vaccine, and then if I do get the virus, I will be better protected. That's enough for a lot of people to still get the vaccine. Why that should affect anyone else should not go into the equation. Whether I'm vaccinated or not should not matter whether I go into a restaurant or to a venue of any sort, because I've made the decision. But city governments have still, some cities have still required that you show proof of a vaccine. I don't understand why. If someone can explain it to me, that's fine. But if it's just that it'll help you not get as sick, it does not stop the spread. And it does not stop you from getting it. I don't understand why we're still checking vaccine cards or why we're requiring it for people. Some other examples are, we can go back to Trump. Trump and the Republicans lied about Stop the Steal. There's zero credible evidence that the election was stolen. I don't want to go into this one anymore. I think this is stupid. I didn't understand it from the beginning. I think it's very shady when you have, I do want to say, when you have one side saying go vote in person, the other side saying vote for mail, well, any sort of fraud is definitely going to be way easier in the mail, right? And that's what the Democrats were doing. That being said, I don't see any evidence. In fact, I believe in Arizona, where they did a recount, Biden actually won by more than was originally reported. So here, again, you have the government spreading, and Trump was still the government at this time, spreading at best misinformation. I want to do a side note and say that the Four Seasons debacle with Rudy Giuliani in that meeting in Philly, I believe it was Philly, is probably my favorite moment in political history. It's an SNL skit if SNL was actually good at their job. Like, when SNL was funny, this would be an SNL skit, was them going to some garden center called the Four Seasons instead of the luxury hotel. Some other instances of misinformation, disinformation that the government and or corporate media has promulgated would be things like all of these racial hate crimes. Many of them, not all of them, but many of them are misreported. So misinformation, or completely, or not covered properly, which would be have intent, disinformation. Some examples of these are like Nick Sandeman, Jussie Smollett, Jacob Blake, Kyle Rittenhouse. These were all completely different. What actually happened was completely different than what the media portrayed. Now, again, that's just the media. They can get things wrong. But the government, famously, for instance, Kamala Harris, visited Jacob Blake, who was a piece of human garbage, who was violating a restraining order when he was arrested and shot, who had sexually assaulted the woman who's his ex-wife or girlfriend right before that. And he's treated like a hero because the media and the government jumps on that for their photo ops without waiting to see what is true and what's not. And these are the people who want to tell you what actually happened when they fuck it up all the time. Nick Sandeman, that was one of my biggest, and I've said this before on the show, I didn't have a red pill moment. It was gradual. I remember tweeting something very mean and snarky about that. Something, and Nick, if you ever hear this, I'd like to apologize. It's something along the lines of, I gave up violence, or I dedicated myself to a life of pacifism years ago, but I would like to punch that kid in the face. Something along those lines. Something really shitty like that. And then when that came out to be completely false, what the corporate media portrayed, when that came out to just be verifiably false, that's when I started to turn and look more closely at what I was being told, because up to that point, I trusted everything that the Washington Post reported. I trusted everything the New York Times reported. So if you're not used to, if you haven't heard this show before, I went through I was very conservative at one point. I voted for John McCain in 2008 in the first election. I was very Fox News downline conservative. But by end of law school, I was a very left-wing progressive, or crit lib, or whatever you want to I believed all of the mainstream narrative. I thought Trump won because of racism, which is not fucking true at all. He won for so many different reasons. 2016. I thought because we're a racist country. It's like, no, that barely scratches the surface of why Trump won. I thought that there was Russian collusion, and that, there was a P tapes and all this other shit. That's not to say I swung back, or I never vote for Trump. I won't vote for him in 2024 if he runs. But so I want to say it's not like I've had one. I've followed a lot of different media, been on a lot of different sides, and heard a lot of different viewpoints. And I think where I am now is just a distillation of all of that. I call myself an independent extremist. I don't have a side. I have some very left-wing views. I have some very right-wing views. And I don't like to use those terms. Some socialists, some libertarians, some nationalists, whatever you want to call it. But that's when I started to turn. It was the Nick Sandeman issue, because it was so wrong. Like, this wasn't like one detail they got wrong. It was so wrong and so obvious why it was wrong. It was because he was wearing a fucking MAGA hat. And he was a white, smug kid from a private school, or appearing very smug at a private school, looking at a Native American. Not a Native American veteran, allegedly. That's how it was reported. Could you find a more sympathetic demographic in this country right now? Well, maybe if he was trans, he would have been more sympathetic. But a war veteran, Native American, elderly man and maybe elderly women will be more sympathetic. But so, that was. I would love to hear what your issue. I think my full turn came in a couple times. It's okay to protest COVID. The real virus is racism. That turned a lot of fucking people. We've been told to stay inside for 3 months. Don't see Nana. Stay inside for 3 months because you're killing Nana. And then another one was the 93% mostly peaceful when there's flames erupting in the background, right? And there's a lot of substance to that. But those were kind of my big turning points. Some others. So how about this? So let's take the DGB at their word and say that they are going to monitor foreign disinformation. What about the Ghost of Kiev? This was verifiably fake. I get it. Propaganda is important during time of war. I can't imagine what the Ukrainians are going through. Putin is an evil bastard. I don't think it needs to be said, but I'll say it anyway. He's an evil fucking bastard. I'm not going to get into the geopolitics of it, but if we're talking about the media, we're talking about the facts that are coming into our country. This was verifiably fake. It was disinformation. It was useful disinformation, even understandable disinformation, but disinformation nonetheless. Is this okay? So is this going to be okay under the DGB? Are we going to start labeling, well, are they our ally? Well, they're our ally right now. So is the Mujahideen was our ally. So was Saddam Hussein was our ally in the Iran-Iraq war. What? So we're gonna let that slide, but we're gonna label Russians, whatever they say is disinformation or not. No, that's why you can't have these monitors as part of the government. If you want to have monitors on the air, I think that's fine if it's just used for informational purposes. But then those monitors get checked. Snopes has been shown to be very partisan. PolitiFact seems to be a little better. Snopes has, they'll twist and manipulate anything to go one way, So another example would be Snake Island. This is, the small island in the Black Sea, and the Ukrainians say Russian worship, go fuck yourself. And then they get bombed and die as martyrs. That was the narrative. What actually happened was they did say go fuck yourself, but they surrendered, as understandably so. They were released. There was prisoner exchanges, whatever it was. But again, that was at best misinformation because it was a good story. It makes sense. I get why the Ukrainians would want to spread that. They're this smaller country facing, being invaded, and for them to say go fuck yourself and then die as martyrs, that's really powerful for a country that's being invaded. But it's still still not true. It's still untrue. So here's the worst one. This to me is so fucking unacceptable, and it gets me. So the drone strike in Kabul in August of last year, we were in a war that should have been a few months long. Joe, I know I'm not going to go into the geopolitics of it. It should have lasted a few months. We had bin Laden pinned down in Afghanistan, and we let him get into Pakistan and prolong the war for another 10 years. Prolong his existence another 10 years. And we were there another 10 years after that. We were attacked when we left by a supposed ISIS K, whatever that is, Kandahar. So understandably, I don't know if we were necessarily attacked. 183 civilians died. I think the vast majority of those were Afghanis. But we sought retribution, so we drone striked who we thought was a terrorist. The target was, in fact, a father who was working, and you can't make this shit up, for a U.S. aid company, organization. I think he was delivering water. I mean, can you get more fucking like, he's, I believe, delivering water. And his children are running out into the street to greet him. So this is an urban setting, and we fucking blow them to smithereens. 10 people died. 7 of them children, none of them terrorists. I mean, you wonder why they fucking hate us. Like, you wonder. I'm not saying it's an excuse for any Americans or Westerners to die, but you wonder why they fucking hate us. Because no one suffered any consequences for that. The government covered it up for as long as they could. I know I raked the New York Times through the coals earlier. They actually did some good reporting. They are capable of good. That's not what I'm saying. Just a lot of it is culture war garbage because that's what gets clicks. They actually did some real reporting. Conveniently, after Biden's approval had started to sink, but, you know, that's a side note, and found that that you know, this was a mistake. No one suffered any consequences, and 7 children died. So these are the and the DGB comes out of the executive branch. Like they will drone strike your family. Just wait till it comes here. Something will happen, and it will be permitted here. I'm telling you. I know it sounds conspiratorial, but it's only a matter of time. We're labeling too many people as terrorists and extremists. It's going to happen here. There's going to be a drone strike on U.S. soil, and that's going to be normalized. So, why? And sorry, the last one gets to me a lot. So, the woman Jankowicz behind this, the other things, I mentioned that she promoted the lies about the mask, the disinformation with the mask. She's also promoted spread the disinformation about Hunter Biden's laptop, which both the New York Times and the Washington Post are bringing them up because they're very Democratic friendly organizations, have verified as true, and the Steele dossier, which has been, as Jankowicz has spread this also, which consumed liberal media for years, was completely false, had no substance to it, and she also spread that. So those are 3 big. So she spread the masks, Steele dossier, and the Hunter Biden laptop cover-up. This is a person who's being paid through U.S. civilian tax dollars, citizen tax dollars, to tell you what is true and what is false. What is misinformation with disinformation in supposed non-partisan manner. I don't know. I don't know if they think we're that stupid or if we don't pay attention. I do want to note that maybe as I say this, maybe she's not going to have her job because allegedly Mayorkas, Alejandro Mayorkas, again, head of the DHS, or the secretary, apparently he stated in front of Congress when asked by Senator Kennedy of Louisiana if he knew about her TikToks spreading disinformation and about these tweets. He said he did not. He did not know. He did not know that she spread the Steele dossier, misinformation with Hunter Biden laptop, disinformation. So maybe she won't have a job by the time this podcast airs. Hopefully this whole thing gets nixed by the time this podcast airs. But don't think they won't try. That's best case scenario. They're going to try it again. And maybe next time it's the Republicans. I'm very hard on the Democrats right now because they're the ones in power. They're the ones who control the vast majority of media and tech, and they're the ones in power. They'll probably be changed by November, at least in Congress. But they have Congress, they have the executive, and they have most of the channels of information. at least the establishment ways. They're losing power, but still, the establishment media, but they're the ones in power. If the Republicans try and pull this too, I would be saying the same thing. I'd be just as critical if they're trying to tell us what to think instead of letting us form out our thoughts and not always agree. And as long as we're not threatening each other or doxing each other, that's okay. It's difficult. It's difficult to say sometimes what is true and what is false. That's better than having the government tell you, which is going to tell you one thing, that we're at war with East Asia, and then when the Republicans or when the other party gets in power, no, we've always been at war with we've always been at war with Eurasia. East Asia is our allies. So to bring it back to art, if you haven't read now's the time to read 1984. I know people throw around Orwellian all the time. A lot of them don't. I don't want to sound smug there. So some people don't use it correctly. They think any sort of change to a word or what a word means is Orwellian. No, that's not. Words change over time. Is it being forced? Is it being changed to the sense of like, well, now if you're using this word, you're a bigot, where if you're using 3 years ago, you weren't. Like, that's not okay, but that's not Orwellian. Orwellian is telling you what to think and manipulating language, changing history in a way that others people, and if you don't conform, then you're othered, and that's Orwellian in the language sense. It's a complete control of what to say and what to think. Any good professor, any good teacher is supposed to teach you how to think, not what to think. And the government is simply trying to do too much here. I hope it's just a desperate attempt by this presidency to kind of virtue signal in a way, but if we just let this shit go, if people don't fight back against it, then they're gonna go through with it. So basically, read 1984. If you're gonna read 1984, you should also read, when you're done, read Brave New World. A lot of times those are paired together. And I've wavered. I used to think that we were headed much more towards a Brave New World dystopian future. In some ways, I think we are. In other ways, unfortunately, I think we're headed more towards the 1984 world. Again, these are extremes. That's the point of dystopian novels, is to take an issue, a problem, and pull it, stretch it out to its most extreme, and then show what the world would be like, or what your country or city or town would be like in that time. And but I do think that we're headed towards a mixture of both of those. And if you want to throw one more into the pot, Fahrenheit 451 in terms of censorship. Read those three. That's your homework, everyone. You won't be disappointed. There's a reason that they're so popular. They're referenced so often. It's because they constantly come. A lot of these were written when certain parties were in power, and they're still important today. Fahrenheit 451, when that was much more of a critique of the right wing. But now it's the left wing that wants to censor and silence and burn books. Mostly. Not always, but mostly. En masse. So that's why it's the value. You want to keep the value that of free speech and freedom of thought and the ability to debate and disagree and even walk away from those debates. And even not debates, there aren't that many debates anymore. Usually they're on college campuses, but a lot of it's just like stuff on the internet. I avoid a lot of that because a lot of it doesn't go anywhere. But the ability to say those things and even walk away and say, well, I don't agree with any of that, but neither of us are being silenced. She was saying one thing, I was saying the other. Neither of us even moved an iota towards the other's opinion, but we're both still on the platform. We're not labeled terrorists. We're not labeled as disinformers, misinformers, and that's it. So that's our first episode of the Reckless Musecast. Solo, Joe, hope you're doing okay up there, buddy. I miss you. And that'll be it. Stay reckless, everyone. And fight the crits.